There's a certain kind of person who moves through life on a different trajectory than most. They build careers, nurture friendships, travel to distant places, create art, and find meaning in ways that feel complete. But when the conversation turns to children, to family planning, to the assumed next chapter, they pause, not with regret or longing, but with clarity. They know, deeply and certainly, that parenthood isn't their path. These are the ones who have looked at the life script handed to them and decided to write their own. And if you've ever been one of them, you know it's not a casual choice. It's not rebellion for the sake of it. It's a fundamental understanding of who you are and what you need to feel fulfilled. But to truly understand people who don't want children, you have to look beyond the stereotypes and into the psychology of what it means to choose a life that society still questions. Most people assume that not wanting children is about disliking them, but for these people, it's rarely that simple. Most of them don't hate children. They might be wonderful aunts and uncles, teachers, or kind neighbors. What they know is that wanting to spend time with children and wanting to raise them are entirely different things. They see parenthood not as a default setting, but as a specific calling, one that requires passion, energy, and a deep desire that they simply don't feel. And unlike regret, which is rooted in fear, their choice comes from self-knowledge. Psychologically speaking, people who don't want children often have what researchers call high autonomy orientation. They value independence, personal agency, and the freedom to shape their lives according to internal values rather than external expectations. They're not following a timeline because everyone else is. They're asking themselves what actually brings them joy, what gives their life meaning, and then building toward that with intention. This isn't selfishness, it's self-awareness. Because while most people move through major life decisions on autopilot, these individuals pause, they question, they examine the why. This kind of thinking requires a certain courage, because choosing not to have children in a society that celebrates motherhood and fatherhood as the pinnacle of human experience is an act of resistance, not against children, but against the narrative that says there's only one way to live a meaningful life. And these people know this resistance intimately. They've felt it in the raised eyebrows, the invasive questions, the assumptions that they'll change their minds eventually. They've been told they're selfish, immature, or broken, that something must be wrong with them, but what they really are is clear with themselves. You'll often find people who don't want children deeply invested in other pursuits, creative work, career ambitions, social causes, relationships, personal growth, not as substitutes for children, but as genuine sources of fulfillment. They might spend years mastering a craft, building a business, or even traveling the world. They might dedicate themselves to causes larger than themselves, to communities that need them, to friendships that feel like family, because for them, legacy is about impact, contribution, and the mark they leave on the world in ways that feel authentic to who they are. There's a term in psychology called pronatalism, the cultural bias that assumes reproduction is natural, desired, and necessary for all adults. It's so embedded in our society that even people who don't want any children will sometimes internalize it, wondering if their feelings are valid, if they're missing some fundamental human instinct. But research shows that the desire to parent isn't universal. Studies indicate that while many people do want children, a significant and growing number of others don't. This doesn't make their lives any less rich or meaningful. They're simply different. They aren't defying nature. They're honoring their truth. One fascinating aspect of their psychology is the intentionality behind the choice. While some people drift into parenthood because it's expected, these individuals actively decide. They weigh the realities, financial strain, loss of freedom, relationship changes, lifelong responsibilities, not to scare themselves, but to be honest. And when they imagine their future, the version with children doesn't light them up. The version without them does. But this same clarity can be isolating, because while others bond over parenting struggles and milestones, people who don't want children watch from the outside. Friendships change when their friends have kids. Conversations narrow, spontaneity disappears, and suddenly, this person finds themselves in a strange liminal space, too old for the carefree 20s, but not part of the parenting club either. They're carving out a third path, and it can feel lonely, not because they want children, but because they want understanding. They want their choice to be respected instead of questioned. They want to exist without justification. There's a loneliness in being misunderstood, because these people often face a strange kind of grief, not for children they don't have, but for the relationships that change because of their choice. Family members who feel disappointed, friends who drift away into baby-focused lives, colleagues who assume they're less mature or committed because they don't have kids at home. The judgment, subtle or overt, becomes exhausting. They learn to guard their choice carefully, to avoid certain conversations, to brace themselves for the inevitable, "you'll change your mind." But here's what makes these individuals psychologically resilient. They've already done the hard work of self-examination. They've questioned their motives, explored their fears, and arrived at a conclusion that aligns with their authentic self. This kind of introspection builds psychological strength, because when you know who you are, external pressure loses its power. They don't need validation from a society that can't understand them. They've validated themselves. Psychologically, people who don't want children often experience what's called identity foreclosure resistance. While many people adopt identities based on social roles, like parent, spouse, provider, without much reflection, these individuals resist this foreclosure. They refuse to let one role define them entirely. Instead, they build multifaceted identities around their interests, values, relationships, and contributions. This makes them psychologically complex and often more adaptable, because their sense of self isn't tied to a single role that could change or disappoint. There's also something profound about how these people relate to time. Without the structure of school schedules, extracurriculars, and child-rearing timelines, their lives unfold differently. They can pursue long-term projects, take career risks, travel spontaneously, or simply rest without the constant demands of caretaking. This isn't laziness or irresponsibility. It's a different relationship with how life can be lived. They're not living for someone else's future, they're living in their own present. But make no mistake, this choice isn't without its challenges. These people grapple with questions about legacy, about who will care for them when they're old, about whether they'll have regrets. These are very real concerns to have, and they think about them deeply, but they also know that having children doesn't come with any guarantees, so they build different safety nets, strong friendships, financial planning, communities of choice. They create lives that feel secure not because they've followed tradition, but because they've built something intentional. One of the most misunderstood aspects of their psychology is the assumption that these people are hedonistic or shallow. Research tells a different story. Studies show that people who don't want children are often highly engaged in meaningful work, volunteerism, and creative pursuits. They contribute to society in ways that don't involve raising the next generation, but still matter deeply. They mentor, they create, they heal, they teach, they build. Their lives have purpose, just not the purpose others expected. There's a theory in psychology called self-determination theory, which says humans need 3 things to thrive: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. These people aren't missing relatedness just because they don't have children. They find it in friendships, partnerships, communities, and causes. They're not lacking competence because they're achieving it in careers, hobbies, and personal growth. And as for autonomy, that's where they truly flourish, because they've claimed the right to design their own life, and that freedom fuels everything else. If you've ever wondered why people who don't want children seem so certain, it's because they've lived in a world that constantly questions them, and they've had to develop an unshakable level of self-trust. They've heard every argument. You'll regret it. Who will take care of you? Don't you want to leave a legacy? What if you meet someone who wants kids? And they've thought through every single one thoughtfully, because they know their choice affects not just them, but their potential partners, family dynamics, and social belonging. So they don't take it lightly. They take it seriously. And that seriousness is often mistaken for coldness when really, it's responsibility. But for all their certainty, these individuals can still experience moments of doubt, not about wanting children, but about whether they're allowed to be happy with their choice. Society sends constant messages that parenthood is the ultimate fulfillment, and even the most confident of these people can sometimes feel a tug of doubt. This is called ambient pronatalism, the background cultural noise that equates human worth with reproduction, and it's powerful It seeps in through commercials, conversations, and cultural narratives until even those who've opted out wonder if their joy is valid. But here's where their psychology gets really interesting. When people who don't want children reach middle age and beyond, research shows they're often just as happy, if not happier, than their parent counterparts. They report high life satisfaction, strong relationships, and a sense of purpose. The regret that society predicts rarely materializes in the way people expect, because they've built lives that genuinely fulfill them. They haven't spent decades resenting a choice they were pressured into. They've spent those years becoming exactly who they wanted to be. There's something deeply human about the way these people exist in the world. They remind us that there isn't one template for a meaningful life, that fulfillment can come in many forms, that choosing yourself isn't selfish if it means you're living authentically. They show us that love doesn't have to look like nuclear families, and that legacy can be measured in art, ideas, kindness, and change, not just genetics. The psychology of people who don't want children reveals something important about human diversity, that not everyone is wired the same way, that some people thrive in the structure and love of parenthood, while others thrive in the freedom and possibility of a child-free life. Neither is better, neither is wrong. They're just different paths to the same destination, a life well lived.